Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Arizona Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, beneath the scorching Arizona sun of 1873, a tale of calculated horror unfolded that would remain buried in territorial archives for nearly a century. This is the documented account of what became known as the Copper Canyon Incident, COP, a series of events surrounding the Mackenzie sisters and their establishment that served weary travelers more than just whiskey and beer. The year was 1873. The Arizona Territory had been established for just over a decade, and the promise of copper, silver, and gold drew men from across the country to this harsh, unforgiving land. Approximately 17 miles northeast of Prescott, then the territorial capital, along what is now the Black Canyon Highway, stood a small mining settlement called Bumblebee Creek. It was little more than a collection of wooden structures, a general store, and a prominent two-story building that served as both saloon and boarding house, the Copper Queen. The Arizona Territory of the 1870s was still very much a frontier in every sense of the word. President Lincoln had signed the Arizona Organic Act in 1863, separating it from the New Mexico Territory, but formal governance remained minimal at best. The Apache Wars were ongoing, with Geronimo and other leaders actively resisting encroachment on tribal lands. The Southern Pacific Railroad had yet to reach the territory, making travel arduous and communication sporadic. Prescott, established as the territorial capital in 1864, was struggling to maintain its position of prominence against the growing influence of Tucson to the south. The discovery of silver in Tombstone was still a few years away, and the infamous gunfight at the OK Corral would not occur until 1881. This was Arizona before it became fixed in the American imagination, raw, dangerous, and largely lawless. The federal government maintained only a token presence, primarily through military outposts like Fort Whipple, near Prescott, and scattered Indian agencies. Law enforcement consisted of a territorial marshal with a handful of deputies responsible for an area roughly the size of modern Italy. Local governance fell to appointed officials whose authority often extended only as far as their personal influence or the threat of their weapons. It was against this backdrop of limited oversight and that abundant opportunity that the Mackenzie sisters established themselves and their deadly enterprise. According to territorial records and newspaper accounts from the Prescott Miner, the establishment was owned and operated by Sisters Margaret and Elizabeth Mackenzie, who had arrived from Missouri in early 1872. The women, aged 27 and 25 respectively, were unusual figures in a landscape dominated by rugged men seeking fortune. Their arrival was noted briefly in the territorial newspaper. Two sisters of respectable bearing have established themselves in business at Bumblebee Creek, offering clean lodgings and home-cooked meals to the weary traveler. What the newspaper failed to mention was that the sisters had appeared seemingly overnight, with resources that seemed disproportionate to their modest backgrounds. County deed records show they purchased the property with cash, unusual for women traveling alone in that era. More unusual still was that no one questioned their presence or means. The territorial census of 1870 lists no Mackenzies in Arizona, and inquiries to Missouri authorities years later revealed no record of sisters matching their descriptions from the counties they claimed as their origin. It was as if they had materialized from the dust of the desert itself, carrying with them a dark purpose that would not become apparent until it was too late for many unfortunate souls. The settlement of Bumblebee Creek itself had a troubled history even before the sisters' arrival. Founded in 1868 as a mining outpost after small copper deposits were discovered in the nearby hills, it had briefly flourished before a series of violent incidents earned it a reputation as unlucky ground among the more superstitious miners. In 1870, 3 prospectors were found dead in their claim, allegedly the result of a dispute over boundaries. A letter from Indian agent Calvin Williams to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington, dated June 1871, mentions Bumblebee Creek as a settlement of dubious character, frequented by men seeking to avoid scrutiny from both military and civilian authorities. He notes that the settlement's location, in a narrow valley with multiple escape routes into the surrounding hills, made it ideally situated for those with reasons to depart hastily. By the time the Mackenzie sisters arrived, Bumblebee Creek was in decline, with many miners having moved on to more promising claims elsewhere. The following year, the first saloon owner was discovered hanging from a cottonwood tree, officially ruled a suicide, though rumors persisted of foul play related to gambling debts. The territorial government, however, maintained a small office there due to its strategic location on the route between Prescott and the northern mines, making it a natural stopping point for travelers and freight wagons. This positioning would prove crucial to the sisters' operation. The Copper Queen stood at the settlement's edge, the last building before the trail wound north through increasingly desolate country. For travelers heading into the wilderness, it represented a final opportunity for comfort. For those returning to civilization, it offered welcome relief after days or weeks in the harsh landscape. The building itself had an unusual history. Originally constructed in 1869 by a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller as a combination trading post and home, it had changed hands twice before the Mackenzies acquired it. Miller had incorporated architectural elements unusual for frontier construction. Thick adobe walls reinforced with timber, a root cellar dug deep into the hillside, and a second story with dormer windows that gave it an almost European appearance. Local legend, recorded by folklorist J.D. Harrington in 1937, held that Muller had built secret compartments into the walls to hide valuables, a common practice among frontier settlers who distrusted banks or had reason to conceal their assets. Whether this was true or merely convenient folklore that later helped explain the Mackenzies' modifications remains uncertain. What is documented is that Miller died under unclear circumstances in late 1870. The county coroner's report simply states death by misadventure, though a note in the margin mentions an unusual blue tinge to the lips, suggesting respiratory distress. His property passed briefly to a mining investor who never occupied it, then to a saloon keeper named Jackson, who operated it for 6 months before selling to the Mackenzies. The sisters immediately set about transforming the property. They hired local laborers to make extensive renovations, paying generously for swift work. John Carter, one of the carpenters employed, later recalled to investigators they had real specific ideas about what they wanted built. Strange requests like that false back in the wardrobe and the reinforced floor in the back room. I figured maybe they was worried about Apache raids and wanted hiding places. Paid cash, no questions asked, so neither did we. The renovations took approximately 6 weeks, during which the sisters stayed at a boarding house in Prescott. They made frequent trips to oversee the work, always arriving together and leaving together. The laborers noted that Elizabeth, the younger sister, carried a notebook in which she made detailed sketches and measurements, while Margaret handled all financial transactions. By March 1872, the Copper Queen was open for business. The transformation was remarkable. The rough trading post had become a respectable establishment with polished wooden floors, actual glass windows, a luxury in the territory, and furnishings that must have been transported at considerable expense from Prescott or possibly as far as California. According to the Prescott Miner, the opening night drew visitors from as far as 10 miles away, curious to see the establishment that was bringing a touch of St. Louis refinement to our rugged territory. The article described Margaret Mackenzie as a handsome woman of commanding presence who oversees the saloon with a firm but gracious hand, while Elizabeth was noted as more reserved in manner, yet meticulous in her attention to the comfort of overnight guests. The sisters quickly established a reputation for running a respectable business, unusual in a frontier environment where most saloons were rough establishments offering raw whiskey, gambling, and often prostitution. The Copper Queen, by contrast, served better quality spirits, offered meals at regular hours, and maintained strict rules about behavior. Fighting, excessive drunkenness, and lewd conduct were not tolerated, with offenders barred from returning. This atmosphere of relative refinement attracted a different clientele than the typical frontier saloon. While local miners and cowboys still frequented the establishment, it also drew travelers of means, merchants, investors, attorneys, and others whose business brought them to the territory and who preferred accommodations a step above the usual frontier fare. It was precisely this clientele that would prove most valuable and vulnerable to the Mackenzies' true enterprise. The first 6 months of operation passed without incident. The sisters became known figures in the small community, though they maintained a certain distance. They attended the occasional social gathering in Prescott, but formed no close friendships. They contributed appropriately to community causes, particularly those that enhanced their reputation. A donation to the nascent school, funds for a church building fund, support for a sheriff's posse pursuing cattle rustlers. Margaret, the more socially adept of the pair, cultivated relationships with territorial officials and businessmen who passed through, engaging them in conversation and ensuring they received preferential treatment at the Copper Queen. Elizabeth, by contrast, remained in the background, efficient but reserved, speaking little but observing much. The first documented irregularity associated with the Mackenzie sisters appears in a complaint filed with the Territorial Marshal's Office in August 1873. A letter from a Mrs. Eleanor Whitman of San Francisco inquired about her husband, Gerald Whitman, a mining investor who had traveled to the Arizona Territory and whose last correspondence mentioned taking lodgings at an establishment run by two sisters near Prescott. The marshal's cursory investigation concluded that Mr. Whitman had likely continued his journey to the southern mines, or perhaps Mexico. His luggage, however, was found in storage at the Copper Queen, allegedly left behind with instructions to forward it to Tucson. Instructions the sisters produced on a note that Mrs. Whitman later claimed did not match her husband's handwriting. What the official report neglected to mention, but was recorded in Deputy Marshal James Corrigan's personal journal, discovered decades later, was that Whitman had been carrying nearly $5,000 in bank drafts and gold coin, a substantial sum in 1873. The deputy noted, "Inquired of banking house in Prescott, no drafts in Whitman name cashed." Sisters claim he spoke of associates in Tucson who would handle his business affairs. Something unsettles me about their manner, too rehearsed perhaps. Gerald Whitman's background, pieced together from San Francisco business records and his wife's subsequent correspondence with authorities, reveals he was a 42-year-old former merchant who had accumulated modest wealth during the California gold rush, not through mining, but by supplying miners. By 1873, he had transitioned to investing in mining operations rather than supplying them, using his knowledge of the industry to identify promising ventures. His journey to Arizona was for the purpose of evaluating several silver claims near what is now Jerome. According to his last letter to his wife, dated June 12, 1873, he had completed his initial assessments and found them promising enough to warrant substantial investment. He mentioned staying at a surprisingly civilized establishment run by two sisters from Missouri and his intention to conclude negotiations within the week before returning home. He was never seen again. This was the first thread in what would become a tapestry of disappearances associated with the Mackenzie establishment. Between June 1873 and November 1874, territorial records indicate that at least 7 men of means who passed through Bumblebee Creek were never documented as having reached their next destination. In each case, the last confirmed sighting was at the Copper Queen. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the disappearances themselves, but the calculated efficiency with which the sisters operated and the community's complicit silence. As one former resident, interviewed in 1952 by Arizona State University researchers, recalled, "My grandfather said folks knew something wasn't right with those women, the way they'd single out certain travelers, always the ones traveling alone, always the ones who seemed to have money." But nobody said nothing. In those days, you minded your own business if you wanted to keep breathing. Another account, from Harriet Schultz, whose father had been the settlement's general store proprietor, revealed more troubling details. Father noticed that whenever a particular type of guest stayed at the Queen, Margaret Mackenzie would visit his store the following day with unusual requests. Once it was for extra lye soap and coal oil, amounts that seemed excessive for a normal cleaning. Another time she sought to purchase a saw and shovel well after dark, claiming a guest had complained of a rat in his wall. Father said her hands were stained that night, though she wore gloves after that when she came to the store. The operation of the sisters' establishment followed a pattern, according to assembled accounts. The Copper Queen offered two types of accommodations: basic rooms with shared facilities for the common miner or cowhand, and premium rooms for travelers of means. These premium rooms were always located at the far end of the second floor, where the building adjoined the hillside behind it, a curious architectural feature that would later prove significant. The building itself, constructed originally as a trading post in 1869, had been modified extensively by the sisters. County records show they filed permits for structural improvements within weeks of acquiring the property. These improvements, ostensibly to shore up the hillside exposure and expand the guest quarters, created the hidden infrastructure that would facilitate their crimes. Margaret, the elder sister, typically worked the main floor, serving drinks and engaging patrons in conversation. She was described in multiple accounts as striking rather than conventionally beautiful, with auburn hair always meticulously arranged and eyes that seemed to appraise rather than merely see. She had a remarkable memory for details and an ability to extract information from patrons without seeming intrusive. A letter from William Stanton, a Philadelphia manufacturer who would later become one of the sisters' victims, to his business partner in April 1874, mentions Margaret, "The proprietress here is a most unusual woman. Within an hour of my arrival she had ascertained the nature of my business in the territory, the extent of my holdings in Pennsylvania, and even the preparatory school attended by my sons, all through what seemed like casual conversation. I found myself speaking more freely than is my custom with strangers, particularly regarding financial matters. There is something in her manner that inspires confidence, though on reflection I wonder at my own loquacity." Elizabeth, described in accounts as the quiet one with eyes that never seemed to blink, managed the rooms and served meals. Where Margaret was outgoing and charismatic, Elizabeth was reserved, efficient, and watchful. The contrast in their personalities created a complementary dynamic that served their operation well. Margaret identified and charmed potential victims, while Elizabeth managed the practical aspects of their elimination. A diary entry from Rebecca Tilson, a rare female guest who stayed at the Copper Queen while traveling to join her husband in Prescott, provides one of the few insights into Elizabeth's character. The younger Miss Mackenzie moves through the house like a shadow, appearing suddenly where you least expect her. Twice today I turned to find her standing silently behind me, observing. When I commented on her quiet tread, she smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and said simply, "In our business, it's best not to disturb the guests." Something in her gaze made me uncomfortable enough that I've decided to continue to Prescott tomorrow, rather than rest here another day as planned. Together they created an atmosphere of respectable comfort, rare in frontier establishments. The Copper Queen became known for its clean rooms, well-cooked meals, and the unusual refinement of its proprietresses. This reputation attracted precisely the clientele the sisters sought, men of means traveling the territory on business rather than the rough miners and cowboys who populated most frontier saloons. Thomas Finch, a mining engineer who stayed at the Copper Queen in October 1873 and later provided one of the few first-hand accounts, wrote in his journal, "The elder Miss Mackenzie possesses an unusual memory for details. Upon hearing I was bound for the Vulture Mine, she recalled precise details about 3 other gentlemen who had traveled that route in recent months, down to the contents of their luggage. When I remarked upon this ability, her expression changed momentarily to something I cannot quite describe, before she laughed it away, saying, 'A good hostess remembers her guests, Mr. Finch, particularly those she hopes might return.'" Finch's journal, published in part in the Journal of Arizona History in 1954, continues, "Miss Elizabeth maintains the establishment with remarkable attention to detail. The sheets are pressed, the floors swept clean of the ever-present dust, and the meals would not be out of place in a San Francisco hotel. Yet there is something in her manner that causes one to avoid meeting her gaze directly. She moves through the rooms like a shadow, appearing suddenly where she had not been moments before. I confess to feeling watched, though perhaps this is merely the natural wariness of a man accustomed to the dangers of the frontier." Finch survived his stay, perhaps because he mentioned colleagues who would be following his same route within the week. Others were not so fortunate. The case of Robert Cartwright provides a particularly well-documented example of the sisters' methodology. Cartwright, a 38-year-old banker from Chicago, arrived at the Copper Queen on February 17, 1874. His purpose in the territory was to evaluate several mining operations that had sought financing from his institution. According to the stage company's records, he was carrying a leather portfolio containing substantial bank drafts and letters of credit. Margaret Mackenzie personally showed him to one of the premium rooms and, according to the bartender's later testimony, spent considerable time discussing his itinerary and business over dinner. Elizabeth was observed taking his luggage up and later bringing additional blankets, though the evening was not particularly cold. The following morning, Cartwright was not present for breakfast. When inquiries were made, Margaret explained that he had departed early, having decided to proceed directly to Phoenix rather than continuing to the northern mines as originally planned. She produced a note allegedly written by Cartwright, thanking them for their hospitality and indicating his change of plans. 3 weeks later, when Cartwright failed to return to Chicago as scheduled, his bank sent inquiries to various territorial officials. The investigation was perfunctory, the note was accepted as genuine, and his disappearance was attributed to the common frontier practice of men abandoning previous lives for new opportunities. What no one knew at the time was that Elizabeth Mackenzie had made a detailed study of handwriting and document forgery. Among her personal effects, discovered after their flight, was a notebook containing practiced signatures of at least 9 different men, including Cartwright's. The precision of these forgeries was remarkable enough that when they were later examined by a document specialist from Wells Fargo in 1952, he commented that they would have passed scrutiny in any bank of the period. The first tangible evidence that something was amiss came in February 1874, when seasonal rains caused a washout along the creek bed behind the Copper Queen. A freight driver named Samuel Doane discovered what he initially thought was an animal bone protruding from the eroded bank. Closer inspection revealed a human femur. According to the Territorial Marshal's report, dated February 17, 1874, an investigation uncovered the partial remains of what appeared to be 2 adult males. The report notes, bodies appear to have been interred for approximately 6 to 8 months. Identification impossible due to condition and absence of distinguishing effects. Cause of death undetermined. What the official report omitted was that both sets of remains showed evidence of having been bound at the wrists with the same type of cord used at the Copper Queen for tying back curtains. This detail appears only in the personal notes of Deputy Marshal James Corrigan, found among his effects after his death in 1911 and subsequently archived in the Arizona Historical Society collection in Tucson. Corrigan's notes, written in a private cipher that was not decoded until 1956, reveal his growing suspicion of the Mackenzie sisters. Found same cordage as used at the Queen. Mentioned this to Marshall Davis, who advised letting the matter rest. Later learned Davis received a substantial loan from M. Mackenzie last fall for gambling debts. Have documented measurements and samples privately, something very wrong at Bumblebee Creek. Corrigan's position was a precarious one. As a deputy with limited authority, challenging his superior or making accusations against established business owners, particularly ones with political connections, could end his career or worse. Nevertheless, he continued to collect evidence surreptitiously, maintaining a separate, unofficial investigation. His notes detail observations of the Mackenzie sisters' pattern of behavior. M. always engages male travelers of means in extended conversation, particular interest in those traveling alone with no clear destination or schedule. E. always prepares the far rooms personally, allowing no one else to clean or maintain them. After certain guests depart, sisters often make purchases at general store that seem inconsistent with normal operations. The discovery prompted little official action. The remains were reburied in unmarked graves at the Prescott Cemetery, and the incident was attributed to typical frontier violence, possibly the result of gambling disputes or robbery. No connection was publicly made to the Mackenzie sisters or their establishment. In fact, the sisters' standing in the community seem to have improved around this time. A notice in the Prescott Miner from March 1874 mentioned their donation to the territorial capital's first church building fund, and Elizabeth Mackenzie was appointed to the newly formed school board for the Bumblebee Creek settlement. The territorial governor's correspondence from April 1874 includes a letter commending the Mackenzies for bringing civilization and refinement to our developing territories, and suggesting their establishment as a model for proper development. The letter specifically mentions their discretion regarding matters that might otherwise deter investment in our promising region, a curious phrase that takes on sinister significance in light of later discoveries. This veneer of respectability was carefully cultivated. As was revealed later, the sisters maintained detailed notebooks documenting the comings and goings of every guest, with particular attention to those traveling alone, those carrying significant sums, and those whose disappearance might go unnoticed for some time. These notebooks, discovered decades later, contained coded entries that researchers from Northern Arizona University partially deciphered in 1963. The code used simple substitutions and referred to potential victims as stock, with annotations about their quality and processing. One entry, dated July 14, 1873, reads when decoded, "Boston stock arrived today. Quality excellent. Processing scheduled after assessment of documents. M will handle the accounts while E prepares the special room." Another from September 3rd of the same year, Chicago merchant departed officially for Tucson, actual disposal completed before dawn. Yield $100 to $200 in paper, $340 in gold, and deeds to Illinois properties requiring further investigation, left clothing and personal effects as planned. E, concerned about recent inquiry from San Francisco regarding previous acquisition, assured her our arrangements are secure. A particularly disturbing entry from January 1874 reads, "Processing of St. Louis attorney completed with unusual difficulty. Subject partially regained consciousness during procedure. E. Forced to employ excessive measures resulting in significant cleaning issues. Yield substantial but complications necessitate 3-day closure for thorough sanitization of special room. Will claim water damage from roof leak to explain odors," and closing. The special room would later be identified as a concealed space built into the hillside behind the Copper Queen, accessible only through a false back in a wardrobe in one of the premium guest rooms. The dimensions of this room, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with a dirt floor that sloped toward a narrow tunnel leading to the creek bed, suggested its grim purpose. Archaeological examination of the site in 1955 revealed traces of blood that had seeped into the clay floor and evidence of coal oil used repeatedly to clean the space. Metal rings embedded in the walls indicated restraints had been employed. The tunnel, roughly 30 feet in length, emerged in a dense thicket of mesquite along the creek, providing a concealed route for disposing of bodies. The sisters' method appears to have been methodical. According to reconstructed events based on the discovered documentation and physical evidence, they would identify victims who met their criteria, traveling alone, carrying significant funds, and unlikely to be immediately missed. These guests would be given one of the premium rooms with access to the hidden chamber. At night, likely after serving drugged drinks, analysis of preserved bottles found on the property in 1952 showed residue consistent with laudanum mixed with whiskey. The sisters would move the incapacitated victim into the hidden room. There, they would eliminate the victim, though the exact method remains speculative due to lack of forensic evidence, before robbing them of valuables and documents. A journal entry attributed to Elizabeth, though the handwriting analysis remains inconclusive, provides a chilling glimpse into their methodology. M insists on speaking with them extensively before the procedure, says it helps her better forge their handwriting later. I find this unnecessary exposure, but her forgeries have prevented inquiries thus far. The Whitman matter proves the system works, though we must be more thorough with personal effects. The watch was an oversight. Another entry, dated March 1874, reveals the coldly practical nature of their operation. M suggests we increase capacity by adding a second processing area. I disagree. Current volume is manageable, and expansion increases risk of discovery. Better to maintain quality over quantity. The merchandise we select must continue to meet our established criteria: solitary, wealthy, and transient. Deviation from this profile has proven problematic in the past. The bodies were apparently disposed of via the tunnel leading to the creek bed, buried along the bank in locations that would be subject to seasonal flooding, nature's way of concealing evidence. The sophistication of this operation suggests the sisters were not novices to criminal activity. Indeed, subsequent research by historian Rebecca Tanner in 1967 uncovered evidence suggesting the Mackenzies may have operated previously under different names in Missouri and Kansas, always in frontier settings where transient populations and limited law enforcement created ideal conditions for their predation. Newspaper accounts from Independence, Missouri in 1870 mention the mysterious disappearance of 3 travelers who had stayed at a boarding house run by 2 sisters of genteel appearance who left the area shortly thereafter. A wanted notice from Dodge City, Kansas, dated 1871, describes 2 women, matching the Mackenzies' general description, who were sought for questioning in connection with the disappearance of a cattle buyer. The notice was never followed up and no arrests were made. The sisters, if indeed they were the same women, had moved on before authorities connected them to the missing man. The pattern suggests a methodical, migratory predation strategy. Establish a respectable business in a frontier area, operate until suspicions begin to arise or a better opportunity presents itself, then move on with accumulated wealth to establish a new identity elsewhere. The Arizona Territory, with its sparse population, limited communication infrastructure, and general lawlessness, would have represented an ideal operating environment for such predators. What remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case is how the sisters maintained their operation despite growing suspicions. Evidence suggests they employed a combination of strategic bribery, blackmail, and community manipulation. A letter found in the territorial governor's archived correspondence, dated September 1874 but not discovered until 1960, reveals that Margaret Mackenzie had made a substantial donation to the governor's re-election fund with a note mentioning our mutual interest in ensuring the continued growth and stability of the territory without undue attention to unfortunate incidents that might deter investment. The sisters also maintained what appears to have been a calculated system of community indebtedness. The ledgers of several Prescott businesses show that the Mackenzies extended unusually generous credit terms to influential citizens, effectively buying silence through financial obligation. They also made strategic gifts to community projects that enhanced their reputation while creating a network of beneficiaries who would be reluctant to question their activities. The territorial newspaper editor, John Marion, received a business loan of $300, equivalent to nearly $7,000 today, in July 1873, shortly after publishing a brief article questioning the number of solitary travelers who passed through Bumblebee Creek but never reached their stated destinations. No follow-up article ever appeared, and subsequent mentions of the Mackenzies or their establishment were uniformly positive. More sinister still was their apparent gathering of compromising information. Elizabeth Mackenzie served as the settlement's unofficial postmistress for a period, giving her access to private correspondence. Margaret's position behind the bar allowed her to observe indiscretions and gather confessions from men whose tongues were loosened by alcohol. They also appear to have known precisely which local officials had visited prostitutes, accumulated gambling debts, or engaged in other activities that might compromise their standing. A small black book discovered among their abandoned possessions contained encoded notes on various prominent citizens, including details that could only have been obtained through intimate knowledge of their private affairs. One entry, partially decoded, reads, Judge H. visits Chinese girl at Wong's establishment every Tuesday, pays double to ensure privacy, mentioned during intoxication that his wife believes he attends Masonic meetings. Another notes, Marshall D. now owes $1,050 to gambling house in Prescott. Third time his debt has been settled by unknown benefactor, leverage increasing. As one territorial marshal's deputy reportedly said to his wife in private correspondence, those women know too much about too many men who matter. Nobody's going to look too hard at what happens up at their place, no matter how many San Francisco dandies go missing. This combination of financial leverage, social standing, and blackmail potential created a protective shield around the sisters that allowed them to operate with virtual impunity. When questions arose, they were quickly silenced by those whose interests aligned with maintaining the status quo. The case of Gerald Whitman exemplifies this dynamic. When his wife's inquiries reached Territorial Marshal William Davis, the investigation was perfunctory at best. Davis, whose gambling debts to Margaret Mackenzie were documented in her private ledger, concluded that Whitman had simply continued his journey without informing his wife, a common enough occurrence on the frontier to seem plausible. Mrs. Whitman, however, persisted. In October 1874, she traveled to Prescott herself, an arduous journey for a woman alone. Her diary, preserved in the California Historical Society collection, records her frustration. The officials here seemed determined to dismiss my concerns. When I mentioned certain inconsistencies in the story told by the Mackenzie women, Marshal Davis became quite agitated and suggested I was overtired from my journey and perhaps imagining conspiracies where there were none. He advised me to return to San Francisco and await word from Mr. Whitman, assuring me that many men find the freedom of the territories too enticing to hurry home. His meaning was clear and deeply offensive. Eleanor Whitman's persistence might eventually have exposed the truth had events not overtaken her inquiries. She remained in Prescott for 3 weeks, conducting her own investigation despite official discouragement. She even visited the Copper Queen, where she reported Margaret Mackenzie was excessively solicitous, yet her eyes remained cold as stone. What Mrs. Whitman did not know was that her presence had created considerable alarm for the sisters. A coded note dated October 28, 1874, indicates they were considering processing San Francisco widow despite complications, suggesting they contemplated eliminating her as well. Only the presence of a traveling companion who joined her in Prescott, a cousin mentioned in her diary, appears to have prevented this outcome. Mrs. Whitman's inquiries, while unsuccessful in the immediate term, did create a degree of scrutiny that made the sisters increasingly cautious. Their coded communications from this period show growing concern about increased attention and discussion of possibly relocating operations to a less conspicuous location. One entry from early November 1874 reads, "M. concerned about persistent widow. E. thinks waiting until situation resolves naturally is safest approach. Current inventory sufficient for comfortable transition, if necessary. Southern location previously discussed remains viable alternative." The Mackenzie sisters' operation might have continued indefinitely had it not been for an unexpected development in November 1874. A severe early winter storm caused a section of the hill behind the Copper Queen to collapse, exposing part of the hidden room and tunnel system. According to the Prescott Miner's account, published November 27, 1874, the collapse occurred during the night, and by morning the Mackenzie sisters had vanished. The article states simply, "The proprietresses of the Copper Queen establishment at Bumblebee Creek are reported to have departed unexpectedly, following significant damage to their property during Tuesday's storm." Marshall's deputies investigating the scene found concerning evidence that may shed light on several missing persons cases. This understated report belied the gruesome discovery. The collapse had revealed not just the hidden room, but also a previously concealed cellar space containing personal effects belonging to at least 5 different individuals, all of whom had been reported missing over the previous 18 months. These items included pocket watches, correspondence, and distinctive clothing described in missing persons reports. Most damning was a leather-bound ledger containing detailed information about each victim, including the amounts taken, the disposal location of the remains, and methods used to forge documents, transferring property, or sending false correspondence to family members. The ledger, only portions of which survived after a suspicious fire at the Territorial Marshal's office in 1876, included entries such as J. Sullivan, Boston merchant, processed October 12th, yielded $3,250 and property deeds requiring further investigation. Wrote to partner claiming illness, requiring extended stay in Santa Fe. Will need to create death certificate from Santa Fe after appropriate interval. Another entry noted, H. Montgomery, Pennsylvania. Excellent quality. Unexpectedly carrying bearer bonds requiring careful handling. Elizabeth concerned about disposal given recent rains. Solved by using deeper location north of usual site. The Sacramento Union ran a front-page story on December 3, 1874, with the headline, "House of Horrors Discovered in Arizona Territory. Female proprietors suspected in multiple disappearances." The article described the Mackenzies as females of seemingly genteel bearing who concealed monstrous appetites for murder and theft, and suggested they might have claimed upwards of 20 victims. The San Francisco Chronicle followed with its own coverage, particularly focused on the Whitman case, running several articles that criticized territorial authorities for their failure to investigate the disappearances properly. Used clothing and personal effects to create impression of robbery on trail to Phoenix. Marshall's office accepting this explanation without question. The discovery created immediate sensation throughout the territory and beyond. The negligence of Arizona officials, one editorial stated, raises disturbing questions about the competence of territorial governance and the safety of those conducting legitimate business in the region. These articles prompted a congressional inquiry into law enforcement practices in the territories, though, like many such investigations of the era, it produced reports but little substantive action. The territorial governor, facing mounting criticism, authorized more thorough investigation, though some suspected this was primarily to deflect attention from his own possible connections to the case. Despite an extensive search, the Mackenzie sisters were never apprehended. Reports placed them on a southbound stage the night of the storm, but the trail went cold near the Mexican border. Territorial communications with Mexican authorities proved fruitless, though unconfirmed accounts suggested the women may have established themselves in Sonora under different identities. The night watchman at the Prescott Stage Depot later testified that two women matching the Mackenzies' description had boarded the southbound stage at approximately 2 a.m. on November 25th, carrying substantial luggage and paying for their passage with gold coin. He noted that the younger woman appeared agitated, while the elder was composed, almost unnaturally so given the hour and the weather. A telegraph operator in Tucson reported seeing two women of similar description boarding a coach bound for Nogales on November 26. After that, the trail vanishes. Some historians have suggested that the sisters may have had arrangements in place for just such an emergency departure, possibly including false identity papers and cached funds at strategic locations. The investigation that followed revealed the extensive nature of their crimes. Based on financial records and the coded notebooks, authorities estimated that the sisters had murdered between 11 and 17 individuals over their 18 months of operation, acquiring today's equivalent of nearly $2 million in cash, property deeds, and negotiable instruments. The most conservative accounting, based solely on documented disappearances and recovered evidence, confirmed 11 victims. 1. Gerald Whitman, San Francisco investor, last seen June 1873. 2. James Sullivan, Boston merchant, October 1873. 3. Henry Montgomery, Pennsylvania landowner, December 1873. 4. Robert Cartwright, Chicago banker, February 1874. 5. Thomas Wilkins, St. Louis attorney, March 1874. 6. Frederick Holcomb, New York mining investor, April 1874. 7. William Stanton, Philadelphia manufacturer, May 1874. 8. Charles Everton, Boston shipping magnate, July 1874. 9. George Pritchard, Baltimore merchant, August 1874. 10. Samuel Thornton, San Francisco attorney, September 1874. 11. Edward Palmer, Chicago investor, October 1874. The case of Charles Everton is particularly well documented due to his prominence in Boston society and the extensive efforts of his family to determine his fate. Everton, a 45-year-old shipping company owner, had traveled west to explore potential business opportunities related to the anticipated expansion of railroads into the territory. According to stage company records, he arrived in Prescott on July 15, 1874, and spent 2 days meeting with territorial officials and business leaders. On July 17th, he traveled to Bumblebee Creek, allegedly to meet with mining operators in the area. He took lodging at the Copper Queen, where, according to later testimony, Margaret Mackenzie personally served him dinner and spent considerable time discussing his business interests. The following morning, when another guest inquired about sharing transportation to Prescott, he was informed that Mr. Everton had departed early, having decided to visit claims in the northern mountains before returning east. A note purportedly from Everton was produced, thanking the sisters for their hospitality and indicating his change in plans. When Everton failed to return to Boston as scheduled, his family initiated inquiries through business contacts and eventually hired Pinkerton detectives to investigate his disappearance. The Pinkerton agent, Robert Ferguson, traveled to Arizona in September 1874, visiting both Prescott and Bumblebee Creek. His report, submitted to the Everton family and later provided to territorial authorities, noted several inconsistencies in the account given by the Mackenzie sisters. Most tellingly, Ferguson discovered that the mining operation Everton had supposedly gone to visit had ceased operations 3 months before his arrival in the territory, information that a well-connected businessman like Everton would likely have known. Additionally, no one at any of the settlements along the northern route recalled seeing Everton, despite his distinctive appearance and formal Eastern attire, which would have been notable in the rugged mining communities. Ferguson's report concluded, "It is my professional opinion that Mr. Everton never left the Copper Queen establishment alive. The proprietress's account contains numerous contradictions that suggest deliberate deception rather than mere confusion or misremembering. I recommend immediate involvement of territorial authorities at the highest level. The Everton family forwarded this report to both the territorial governor and federal authorities in Washington. Whether due to the Mackenzies' influence or simple bureaucratic inefficiency, no substantial action was taken before the November storm revealed the truth. The actual toll may have been higher, as the sisters' records hinted at additional victims not matched to known missing persons reports. The frontier nature of the territory meant many travelers passed through unregistered, their disappearances potentially unnoticed or unreported. Forensic excavation of the creek bed in spring 1875 uncovered human remains in 7 distinct locations, though flooding and scavenger activity had rendered complete recovery and identification impossible. The remains were collected and interred in a common grave in Prescott, marked only with the date of their discovery. Dr. Michael Jenkins, who performed the examination of the recovered remains, noted in his report, "The condition of the skeletal elements suggests various methods of dispatch, including blunt force trauma to the cranium in at least 3 cases, and what appears to be knife or similar sharp instrument damage to cervical vertebrae in 2 others. One set of remains shows evidence of binding at both wrists and ankles, with stress fractures suggesting the individual struggled significantly before death. The financial impact of the sisters' crimes extended beyond the immediate victims. Property deeds had been fraudulently transferred, business arrangements disrupted, and estates left in limbo. The territorial courts were burdened with cases related to the aftermath for years, attempting to unravel the complex web of financial manipulations the Mackenzies had orchestrated. One particularly troubling aspect emerged during this process: evidence of official complicity. The territorial governor resigned abruptly in December 1874, ostensibly for health reasons, though correspondence suggests he feared exposure of his connections to the Mackenzies. Marshall Davis was removed from office following an investigation that revealed he had received substantial loans from Margaret Mackenzie, coinciding with periods when inquiries about missing persons were redirected or dismissed. A federal investigation, conducted reluctantly and only after significant pressure from Eastern newspapers and families of the victims, concluded in its report, "The ability of the Mackenzie women to operate their criminal enterprise for such an extended period suggests a troubling degree of official negligence at best and active collusion at worst." The apparent reluctance of territorial officials to investigate legitimate inquiries regarding missing persons points to a systematic failure of governance that merits comprehensive reform of territorial administration. No such reform materialized, however, and within a year the case had faded from national attention, though it remained a significant part of the local memory and lore. The Copper Queen itself was not immediately demolished. Records indicate it passed through several owners over the next decade, though none managed to operate it successfully. Local accounts suggest patrons reported cold spots and unexplained sounds in the premium rooms, though these are likely embellishments added to the narrative over time. A diary entry from Joshua Harrington, who briefly operated the building as a trading post in 1877, notes, "Cannot keep employees. All complain of unease, particularly in the rear rooms. Last week, Simmons refused to enter the storage area, claiming he heard scratching from within the walls. Found nothing, but must admit the place has an unwholesome atmosphere. Business suffers as a result." In 1887, the building was destroyed in a fire of suspicious origin. The local newspaper reported simply, "The former Copper Queen establishment, site of notorious events some years past, was consumed by fire Tuesday last." No injuries reported as the building stood vacant at the time. Marshall's office investigating possible arson. Later accounts suggest the fire may have been deliberately set by local residents who considered the building a blight on the community's reputation and a constant reminder of the darkness that had occurred there. No charges were ever filed, and the investigation was closed without conclusion. The land remained vacant thereafter, and the settlement of Bumblebee Creek gradually declined as mining operations shifted to more productive areas. By 1900, it was essentially abandoned, becoming one of many ghost towns dotting the Arizona landscape. The case of the Mackenzie sisters might have faded entirely from memory had it not been for a University of Arizona historical research project in 1952. Graduate student Howard Biggs, researching territorial crime patterns, discovered references to the case in archived Marshall's reports. His subsequent investigation, including interviews with elderly residents who remembered the incidents and excavation of the former Copper Queen site, brought the case back to public attention. Biggs's master's thesis, Murderous Hospitality, the Mackenzie Sisters, and Frontier Justice, remains the most comprehensive academic analysis of the case. Biggs's work was significant, not just for documenting the Mackenzies' crimes, but for exposing the social and political conditions that allowed them to operate. His research revealed that frontier communities often prioritized stability and economic development over justice, creating environments where predators could thrive if they understood how to manipulate local power structures. What made the Mackenzies so effective, Biggs wrote, was not merely their willingness to kill, but their understanding of frontier social dynamics. They recognized that in a society where economic development was the primary concern, those who contributed to prosperity would be protected, while transient victims would be quickly forgotten. They exploited not just individual victims, but the collective values and priorities of a community that privileged progress over protection. The archaeological excavation conducted as part of Biggs's research uncovered additional evidence that had been missed or ignored in the original investigation. The foundations of the hidden room were exposed, along with artifacts including surgical implements, restraints, and personal items belonging to victims that had not been recovered in 1874. Most significantly, Biggs discovered a metal box buried beneath what had been the floor of the sisters' private quarters. The box contained documents that had escaped the original investigation, including additional coded ledgers and correspondence that further illuminated the extent and methodology of their operation. In 1963, additional material came to light when renovations to the old territorial governor's mansion in Prescott revealed a hidden compartment containing correspondence between Margaret Mackenzie and several territorial officials. These letters strongly suggested a network of corruption that had helped shield the sisters from scrutiny and potentially facilitated their escape. The most damning of these documents was a letter dated November 20th, 1874, just days before the sisters' disappearance, warning them of Mrs. Whitman's continued inquiries and suggesting they consider relocation before the situation becomes untenable. The letter was signed only with initials that matched those of a prominent territorial judge. This discovery prompted renewed interest in the case, with several historians and criminologists publishing analyses during the 1960s. The Mackenzie case became a case study in frontier justice and the particular dynamics that allowed female criminals to operate differently than their male counterparts. Archaeological work at the site in the 1960s recovered additional artifacts, including personal items belonging to victims and tools likely used in their processing. Analysis of soil samples revealed traces of human remains in multiple locations around the former establishment, suggesting the sisters' disposal activities had been more extensive than initially documented. The last verified information about the Mackenzie sisters comes from a death certificate discovered in Hermosillo, Mexico, archives in 1967. The document, dated March 14, 1902, records the death of a Señora Margarita Vasquez, formerly of the United States, with her age approximately matching what Margaret Mackenzie's would have been. The cause of death is listed as respiratory failure, though notes indicate the attending physician suspected poisoning. No corresponding record for Elizabeth was ever found, leading to speculation that she may have been responsible for her sister's death, continuing a pattern of betrayal and elimination that characterized their known history. A tantalizing footnote to this theory emerged in 1969 when historian Rebecca Tanner, researching women business owners in the American Southwest, discovered records of a Mrs. Elizabeth Wilson, who operated a successful boarding house in Oaxaca, Mexico from 1902 to 1915. Described as an American widow of refined manners, this woman accumulated considerable property before disappearing abruptly following inquiries from American authorities about a series of guests who had vanished after staying at her establishment. Mexican police records, translated and published in the Journal of Borderland Studies in 1975, indicate that authorities suspected Wilson of multiple homicides, but were unable to gather sufficient evidence for prosecution. The description of her methodology, drugging solitary travelers of means and disposing of their bodies in a ravine behind her property, bears striking similarities to the Mackenzie's Arizona operation. If this was indeed Elizabeth Mackenzie, it suggests she continued her predatory activities for decades after escaping Arizona, adapting her methods to new circumstances, but maintaining the same basic pattern. The final fate of Mrs. Wilson remains unknown, as she vanished from Oaxaca in 1915 amid the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, leaving behind a property that, like the Copper Queen before it, was later destroyed by fire. The site where the Copper Queen once stood is now part of the Prescott National Forest. Nothing remains of the structure except foundation stones and the occasional rusted artifact. Hikers in the area have reported feeling watched, though this is likely the power of suggestion given the location's grim history. In 1965, the Arizona Historical Society placed a small marker near the site, acknowledging the Mackenzie crimes without sensationalizing them. The plaque reads simply, "Near this site stood the Copper Queen Saloon and Boarding House, 1872-1887, scene of numerous disappearances and murders during the territorial period, a reminder of justice delayed and the dark chapters in our shared history." The case has continued to fascinate historians, criminologists, and the public. It has been the subject of numerous books, articles, and at least 2 documentary films. The combination of female perpetrators, frontier setting, and the extensive nature of the crimes makes it a compelling, if disturbing, chapter in Western history. Perhaps most disturbing is the possibility that the Mackenzie sisters were not unique. The frontier offered ample opportunity for predators to operate with minimal oversight, and the transient nature of the population made disappearances easy to dismiss or ignore. How many other such operations existed, run by individuals who, unlike the Mackenzies, were never exposed? Historian Patricia Nelson Limerick, in her analysis of frontier criminality, notes, "The mythology of the West focuses on outlaws like Jesse James or Billy the Kid, men who operated in the open, their crimes acknowledged if sometimes romanticized. Far less attention is paid to those who worked in the shadows, particularly women who used the gender expectations of their era as camouflage for predation." The Mackenzie case challenges our conventional understanding of frontier crime and gender roles. In an era when women were generally viewed as civilizing influences, the sisters weaponized those very perceptions, creating a veneer of respectability that obscured their calculated brutality. Dr. Eleanor Ramsey, professor of criminology at the University of Arizona, observes in her 1998 analysis, "The Mackenzies exploited period assumptions about female behavior. In a society that viewed women as inherently nurturing and morally superior, the idea of women as predators was almost inconceivable. This cultural blind spot created a perfect environment for their operation. Their gender became their most effective disguise." The case raises unsettling questions about how communities can become complicit in evil through silence, convenience, or self-interest. The residents of Bumblebee Creek knew something was wrong. the pattern too obvious, the coincidences too numerous. Yet economic benefit and frontier pragmatism created a conspiracy of silence that cost many lives. As territorial judge William Haynes wrote in his private journal, found among his effects after his death in 1890, the Mackenzie matter represents a failure not merely of law enforcement, but of community conscience. When we prioritize prosperity over probity, when we value our comfort over the lives of strangers, we create the very wilderness we claim to be civilizing. His words seem particularly ironic given the evidence suggesting his own possible complicity in warning the sisters before their escape, a complexity that underscores the moral ambiguity that characterized frontier justice. The psychological aspects of the Mackenzie case have attracted attention from modern criminologists. Dr. Elaine Morrison, in her 2003 analysis, Partners in Predation, The Psychology of Collaborative Female Killers, suggests the sisters represented a rare but documented pattern of complementary pathology. In the Mackenzie case, we see evidence of what would now be classified as a dominant psychopath, Margaret, paired with a more submissive accomplice, Elizabeth. The elder sister appears to have possessed the charisma and manipulative abilities characteristic of psychopathic personality, while the younger provided the methodical attention to detail that made their operation successful. Such partnerships are particularly dangerous precisely because they combine predatory cunning with practical efficiency. Morrison notes that while male serial killers often acted from sexual motivation, the Mackenzies represent a different category of predator, one motivated primarily by material gain and operating with a business-like efficiency. Their methodology was more akin to organized crime than to the impulsive violence typically associated with frontier murders. The sisters, she writes, approached murder as a commercial enterprise, with clearly defined processes, careful record-keeping, and strategic planning. They saw their victims not as people, but as resources to be harvested, a perspective evident in their coded references to stock and processing. This commodification of human life represents a particularly chilling form of psychopathy. The last word on the Mackenzie sisters appropriately belongs to one who almost became their victim. Thomas Finch, the mining engineer who stayed at the Copper Queen in 1873, wrote in 1876, after learning of the discoveries, "I recall with perfect clarity the moment Miss Margaret poured my evening whiskey. There was something in her eyes as she watched me drink, a curious anticipation quickly masked. I declined a second glass, pleading fatigue, but remained awake with my door barricaded. Throughout that night I heard faint sounds of movement in the corridor and what seemed like scraping from within the walls. I departed at first light, earlier than I had informed the sisters I would leave. I have often wondered since if that simple change of plans preserved my life." He continued, "What troubles me most in retrospect is not the narrowness of my escape, but how utterly convincing their performance was. Had I not been rendered suspicious by years in mining camps where men learn to sense danger, I might have accepted their hospitality without question. Civilization depends on trust, on the assumption that the hand offering aid is not the same that will end your life. The Mackenzies exploited that fundamental trust, and in doing so attacked not merely their victims, but the very bonds that hold society together. Today, the story of the Mackenzie sisters serves as a dark footnote in Arizona's territorial history, a reminder that sometimes the most monstrous predators wear the most civilized masks, and that true horror resides not in supernatural phenomena, but in the calculated malice of human hearts. For those traveling through central Arizona, the old Bumblebee Creek site lies just off the modern highway, unmarked and largely forgotten. The creek still flows seasonally, washing away a little more evidence with each passing year. But in archives and memories, the story of the sisters who served more than beer continues to disturb those who encounter it. A stark reminder of frontiers where law was distant and survival sometimes depended on recognizing the danger behind a welcoming smile.